The Ural mountain range may be a conveniently placed physical barrier that divides Europe and Asia, but the eastward expansion of Russia has brought both sides of Eurasia into the same state, and has forever projected Russia as a country with both European and Asian traits, both in its geography and in its state apparatus, which in turn has had understandably major economic, geopolitical, and ideological consequences. The Urals thus both physically divide Russia's two halves and are a symbol of the grandeur of the state that has conquered them. It is thus not surprising to discover that in TNO, the warlords of the Urals and the territory that they control will play a major role in the post-collapse hellscape of Russia. Geographically, the Urals run from the Arctic Ocean to Kazakhstan in Central Asia, and are divided between the frozen polar Urals and the northern, central, and southern Urals. While these regions vary in climate, they all share an abundance of natural resources, including coal, iron ore, nickel, gold, chromium, titanium, bauxite, platinum, potassium, and of course, oil and gas. The strategic importance of these resources and their location in a territory that was integrated comparatively late by the Russians means that the economic development of the region has traditionally been focused on heavy industry, concentrated in conglomerates typically run by the state. And this was even before the birth of the Soviet Union, and the state of affairs has survived the collapse of the Soviet Union. According to the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, the Ural economic region is described as a highly developed and complex in the productive structure of heavy industry. Of Union-wide importance are the ferrous and non-ferrous metallurgy, heavy engineering, chemistry, mineral and gas mining, harvesting, and process of wood. The Ural economic region's industry is particularly characterized by a high level of concentration of production. This economic structure, the history, and the geographical location that give better natural protection from German action leads to an overall wider support for the defunct USSR by the region's regimes in the TNO timeline, with notable exceptions arising from certain anomalies of history, or in the most interesting cases from local particularisms that are derived from local conditions. The first of the Ural warlords is reminiscent of a sad past. It is VORKUTA. VORKUTA is located on the western slopes of the polar Urals, on the river Vorkuta. It is located beyond the polar cycle in the zone of permafrost, making the region nearly uninhabitable. In the region, however, lies the gigantic 242 billion tons of coal of the Pechora coal basin, second only to the Donbass in Ukraine and the Kuznets Bas in central Siberia in its resources. On 600 million tons of recoverable oil deposits, and also other mineral resources. Due to the extreme location, during the 5-year plans in the 30s, it was decided that the region's resources would be exploited by forced labor. This is the same in the TNO timeline as in the real timeline. Thus, the infamous VORKUTA Gulag complex was constructed in 1932. It was the largest of the Gulag camps in European Russia, and served as the administrative center for a large number of smaller camps and subcamps that formed a kind of satellite system. This labor also was the labor that constructed the railway that connects Vorkuta to the civilized world of the rest of Russia. The nearest town of any significance to the camps is in fact hundreds of kilometers away. In the indigenous Nenets language, Vorkuta means many bears, the abundance of bears, or bear corner. Other nearby localities and settlements bear picturesque Russian names such as Zapolyarny, which means beyond the polar, Pramyshleny, which means industrial, and Sieverny, which means northern. In short, Vorkuta is just a concentration of all stereotypes about the Soviet Union, a depressive and oppressive frozen industrial hellscape away from civilization. In the 1960s, the camp was shut down, and the town continues to this day as a mining center in real Russia. A major uprising among the inmates in 1953 is likely what inspires the fate of the camp in the TNO timeline, in which the prisoners and the guards instead unite and escape south. However, Vorkuta is still around and is led by the remnants of the Soviet Navy, headed by Admiral Arseny Golovka. VORKUTA-based ships conduct piracy across the North Seas and as far out as they can go. They have no interest in really expanding under the current regime, and the fleet is likely not that sizable, given that most of the already limited Soviet warships were stationed in the Baltic, Black Sea, and Pacific fleets. The Northern Fleet operated mostly smaller vessels such as submarines, destroyers, and patrol boats, which, of course, are excellent in the capacity of raiders. The Kriegsmarine from Germany would realistically have next to no convoy defense doctrine or capabilities, given that it was a force originally geared to disrupt British trade and naval dominance of the seas rather than to establish a German sea-based dominance or trade. The opponents internally of the Gulag clique, the ruling faction, are the Vladimir Kasatanov clique, who are Otsak and are favor joining forces with the bordering West Russian Revolutionary Front, and the Drozd clique, Klika Drozda, which is social democratic and wants to build a true beacon of freedom upon the frozen seas, whatever that entails. While the Vorkuta Gulag inmates escape south, it is likely that some kind of mining or extraction still goes on in the territory, considering that Vorkuta extracts oil in the game to run its ships. The prison camp network also used to extend south to the neighboring state of Khanty-Mansi. The peoples native to the region are the Khanty and the Mansi people, known collectively as the Ob-Ugrik people from the Ob River, a massive river that flows through Siberia. In 1939, the Khanty were only the 13% of the population, while the Mansi 6% and the ethnic Russians already 72.5%. So, despite the name, these are a minority among their own in their own territory. Khanty-Mansi, however, is also home to many former criminals from all over the Soviet Union, and used to be under the sovereignty of the Red Navy in Vorkuta, until Zlatoust, the southern state neighboring the territory, assisted the local prisoners in rising up and overthrowing the wardens. They extracted the region's oil, bauxite, and chromium for the Soviet Navy, and now they are independent. The Independence War lasted a week, and now the former leader of the former bank robber Yaba Joseliani, or Yoseliani, is the leader of this nation, the president. It is basically just a subsidiary of Zlatoust and is essentially a criminal enterprise disguised as a state. The ruling party is even called the Zlatoust Friendship League. We can find it. Zlatoustskaya Liga Druzhby. Politically active are also the Liberal Democratic Siberian Democratic Party, and the likely religious and despotist Brotherhood of Holy Renewal down here, which might be affiliated with the military theocracy over in Gainsky, which is bordering the state. Yoseliani himself is actually quite a flamboyant historical figure who in real life went from bank robber in Leningrad to an academic career in Georgia, which later transitioned quite strangely into him becoming the leader of a nationalist paramilitary in the conflicts following the collapse of the USSR. Khanty-Mansi's southern client has the resources to maintain control over it thanks to an asset of amazing value in fractured Russia, which is the Soviet weapons industry under their control. Zlatoust is a black market state led by the legendary weapons designers Yevgeny Dragunov and Mikhail Kalashnikov, who supply many of the Russian warlords with their guns. Zlatoust itself was founded in 1754 due to the construction of iron works in the location. In 1774-1776, the workers of the plant actually took part in the insurrection by famous rebel Yemelian Pugachev. In the beginning of the 19th century, the arms factory was expanded there and began to produce more weapons. During the Soviet period, Zlatoust became an industrial city which specialized in metallurgy, mechanical engineering, tool making, food production, and other industries. The arms dealing state may be named after Zlatoust city in the south. But its power is also based on the industry center of Nizhny Tagil in the northwest, which is home to the Ural Vagon Zavod factory, the Ural railroad car factory, which actually became one of the largest tank factories in the world during the Second World War. In fact, probably the biggest one today. We can expect Zlatoust to play a role in nearly every conflict in post-collapse Russia due to its stated willingness to send weapons to just about anybody. Kalashnikov and his buddy Dragunov are ironically co-leading a black market state, but in real life, the famous Kalashnikov, in his old age, actually stated in a letter to the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, that he was suffering spiritual pain about whether he was responsible for the deaths caused by the weapons he created. In a slide of twisted logic in the TNO timeline, the rifle-designing consuls of the Republic stoked the flames of conflict in nearby provinces to keep their republic safe and their neighbors from turning the guns on their producers. Speaking of warlords, to the east is the state of Sverdlovsk, which used to be known as Yekaterinburg during the days of the Russian Empire. The city is known as Russia's window to Asia, just like St. Petersburg in the west is known as the window to Europe, Okno v Evropu. In 1924, the city was renamed Sverdlovsk after the Bolshevik leader Yakov Sverdlov. This is also where Tsar Nicholas II and his family were executed during the revolution. During the Soviet era, Sverdlovsk grew in industry and in political importance, becoming home to the Ural machinery factory, which supplied the Ural mines with equipment and the Red Army with military equipment. In TNO, this important center is ruled by Red Army Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, a veteran of practically all the Red Army's wars. In spite of being led by the Marshal, the Red Army is beginning to show signs of faltering in purpose. Rumors of defeatism and even Tsarist sympathies reach the Marshal's ears more and more, and the last tenets of Communist Party rule have been cast aside since Rokossovsky broke with the southern neighbor Tumen's leader Kaganovich in favor of a regular military leadership. This area all used to be part of a People's Republic of Western Siberia. Rokossovsky's friend and colleague Pavel Batov is expected to succeed the Marshal as the commander of Western Siberia's Red Army. He can either reaffirm commitment to the liberation and steady the course with the Red Army's leadership, or decide that Russia must look back to its old days for survival. In Sverdlovsk, there are actually sort of opposition factions, both supporters of a Tsarist restoration, monarchisty, and of Omsk's Black League of ultranationalists, and there are also Communist Party supporters. To the south, we see the nations of the southern Urals. Now, these are the ones that are already obviously part of the demo, so you will probably know a lot more about them, but in case you haven't seen them already, let's go over them. There's a lot of obviously material to work with here. First one is Magnitogorsk. Magnitogorsk means the city of the magnetic mountain. The titular mountain is composed of an astonishingly high quantity of iron ore. The position has made this a perfect spot to build a porter city for the 5-year plans. A factory city that would churn out more steel by itself than entire countries to fuel the Soviet economy and the war machine. The heart and soil of the Soviet Pittsburgh is the Magnitogorsk Iron and Steel Works factory, which employs the majority of the city's labor force even today. Trofim Lysenko, over here, leads his clique of scientists from atop the Black Mountain, reigning over his people as a dictator. He is helped by the NKVD's 22nd Motor Rifle Division, the NKVD being the Narodny Commissariat Внутренних Дел, or the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, essentially the Soviet state's secret police. Assisted by the Motor Rifle Division, Lysenko abducts an unknowing Russian from the countryside for testing, because he is attempting to create a super soldier, able to finally drive the Germans out of Russia once and for all, a super soldat. His pseudoscientific beliefs and army of scientists make him one of the most feared rulers in the Urals. Magnitogorsk has come to be content with his iron rule, and Lysenko only needs to keep the NKVD in check to prevent others from deposing him. Other than securing cooperation from the NKVD, the other major security requirement for Lysenko's nightmarish goals is prisoners to experiment on. Unfortunately. Lysenko will need to enter conflict with neighboring regimes to acquire subjects, the most prominent being the Ural to the west, which is not only an ideological rival, but also sits in a threatening strategic position on the peaks of the Urals, and astride Lysenko's routes to other Soviet remnants in western Russia. To defeat the defiant and well-positioned Guard, Lysenko can enlist the aid of the most barbaric faction in Russia, to the south, DIRLEWANGER'S Horde. Whether or not the rabid dog can be controlled remains only to be seen. Formed out of former criminals and commanded by a rapist, the DIRLEWANGER'S unit is the most despicable band of men in the SS, and that is saying a lot. In real life, they were involved in terrorizing Belarus, Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary in the Great Patriotic War or World War II, from wherever country you're from. Their most heinous and infamous crimes, though, were committed in the repression of the Warsaw Uprising, where, according to eyewitness accounts, they slaughtered every man, woman, and child they could find, including the wounded, hospital workers, and also used civilians as human shields. During their bloody trek across Eastern Europe, the unit was not only assigned replacements from German prisons, who, unlike those assigned to other penal units, were often convicted of major crimes, not just minor ones, major crimes being murder, rape, arson, and the like, but it was also allowed to recruit indigenous volunteers from the areas that they fought in. So in this way, it could be reinforced by Russians or Ukrainians, often of the same war character as the unit's German members. And the New Order timeline, they have become military renegades after the West Russian War in the 50s, having been forced to escape east due to inter-German conflicts and the Russian advance, and they've been declared renegades from both the SS and Germany, the German Reich, and they have picked up even more murderous Cossacks, Russians, and Kazakh bandits along the way to follow them in their trail of destruction across Russia. The state is, in fact, a little more than a roving band of raiders, a bandit state, and their followers that are being dragged around with them and only sit in one place long enough to lick their wounds and leech the surrounding area of resources. The group is tenuously held together by the bandit king, DIRLEWANGER, and their sole apparent ambition is to rape, pillage, and burn everything in sight. DIRLEWANGER'S chief opponent is the Ural League, which was formed out of Gulag prisoners and guards who joined Forces for Survival in VORKUTA and its satellite camps. The League and all the people in it have settled in the southern Urals after a grueling long march across the mountains of the Ural mountain range, led by Red Army officers on the battlefield, but united in purpose by the Latvian priest Yanis Mendriks, who, by some miracle, managed to reconcile guards and prisoners in common humanity. Joined in the march by survivalists, struggling Red Army remnants, and they settled down in the mountains, creating a fortress far away from civilization where they could live in peace. Also absorbing other camps and former camp guards and prisoners, just like them. The strength is in the quality, discipline, and their strength is in the quality, discipline, and morale of their soldiers, the children of VORKUTA. A historical analog would be the veterans of the Red Army's 9,000-kilometer-long march from somewhere around Jiangxi to Shanxi. Of course, the Long March was actually even longer than what the children of Vorkuta have had to endure. From Vorkuta to the League's location in game, it is, well, something over 2,000 kilometers, I think. However, what the Chinese Red Army did not have is the professionalism and expertise that the League has acquired from commanders that joined them, such as Ilya Starinov. I'm gonna find a way to get him up. Such as Ilya Starinov, who in real life is known as the father of the Spetsnaz, Russia's special forces. They utilize this single precious resource, the quality and fighting spirit of their men, by hiring themselves as mercenaries on various communities of the Russian wastes, lending the assistance to villages in return for supplies for the homeland, which is barren and spoiled. The Guard is in constant conflict with DIRLEWANGE'S bandits and the Sienko's 22nd Mortar Rifle Division, which, combined with their harsh training regimen and the high standards for recruitment and limited size of training facilities, essentially means that the Guard is facing a chronic shortage of men. To remedy this, some officers propose expanding the Guard's auxiliary militias to shoulder more duties, and essentially make the communities within the League and Orenburg more self-sufficient, shifting more burden from the Guard itself to communities and refugees. This has brought the possibility of a strange alliance with the communal state, the communal confederation to the southwest, centered around Orenburg city. Though the Commun's radical libertarian ideology means that it is difficult for them to trust their defense to the militarism of the old-fashioned Guard. In history, unpredictable events sometimes develop seemingly of their own will, dragging places and people into the spotlight where normally they would not be. It is so for Orenburg in the New Order, an unassuming city on the border between Europe and Russia, is so unassuming, and perhaps very lucky, to be mostly spared the destruction, war, and chaos of the end of the Soviet Union. Lacking any major industrial centers or natural resources in the game's earlier timeline, local villages soon return to a way of life centered around land, family, church, and village. In time, Orenburg city itself, ruled by a Soviet, a workers' council, has managed to emerge as a neutral ground where the peasants and the workers of the region can trade and live in peace and meet. The combination of the peace and relative imbalance of power between the city, which has developed quite a bit, and the satellite village communities has eventually coalesced into some semblance of a political unity in the form of the Workers' Council, a confederal body with legislative and executive prerogatives, and that tries to rule over an ever-changing number of villages and towns in the countryside, who appoint a member each year to vouch for their interests in the common unofficial capital. The problem for Orenburg city is that, while it has been able to, in theory, extend its influence and leadership to a wide territory, the extreme decentralization and fears of return to authoritarianism and oppression have definitely held back a booming urban economy, diplomacy, institutions, and military, which remains a small and disorganized militia. Because of the vetoes from council representatives who fear that the city can impose its tyranny over their communities. While Orenburg follows a libertarian socialist model, the communes associated with it are basically just rehashed versions of Russia's traditional communal village society, the Mir or Община, which even predated feudalism and serfdom in Eastern Slavic countryside, so they've been around for thousands of years, and barely survived until the end of the till the turn, essentially, from the 19th to the 20th century, in a series of reforms by the Russian imperial government, championed mainly by a statesman called Stolypin, so they are known as the Stolypin reforms of agriculture, which essentially finally abolished the institution that was slowly dying to accelerate accumulation of land and capital in the countryside, and capitalist development, and the development of a market for agricultural goods. Reforms which are actually quite widely opposed by Russian peasantry and are part of the reason why the Russian countryside was so unstable in the years leading up to World War I and later the February and October revolutions. Orenburg has the communities around Orenburg have managed to, because of the power vacuum, sort of revert back the clock of history. So while the city and the rural communes certainly share ideals and language, both talking about the need for communal representation, autonomy, freedom, and all that kind of stuff, economically, Orenburg city is progressive for all its flaws, while the peasant communities are fundamentally reactionary in character. This contradiction lies at the center of Orenburg's incredibly dysfunctional political system, and it is the internal battle that the city must fight before the vultures really start knocking. The Ural League needs its men and resources to establish its brand of order in the Urals. We can see from their central focus tree over here. Listienko needs the peasants of Bashkortostan as test subjects, and Orenburg's factories for producing goods for the NKVD troops. And DIRLEWANGER wants to pillage the only true city in the southern Urals wastes. And other Russian warlords in the future will likely eye Orenburg as an important stepping stone in the reunification of the whole country, the reunification of Russia, and the key to crossing the Urals east or west, depending on who we are talking about. Because of the coming storm and the apparent impotence of the Workers' Council as a executive and governing body, a fierce political battle is unfolding in the city's streets and meeting halls. Fighting it are the autonomist faction, which is a big tent mostly made up of representatives from the periphery of the commune's territories, which has dominated council for years, and is effectively a conservative faction that wants to maintain as much autonomy to the periphery communes as possible. The second faction is made up of Orenburg council members who want to reform the confederation into a communal system where the Workers' Council is empowered in matters of military and diplomacy, and safeguards the absolute freedom of the outer communes in exchange for some of its prerogatives. Some of their prerogatives. More integrated with Orenburg itself, but still using the same model. The third faction is the political group belonging to former Soviet politician Malenkov. You can see them represented as authoritarian socialist, while the other two factions are both represented as the libertarian socialist communal representatives, and have their own leaders in charge at the start. And this faction is headed by Malenkov, who is a man who is little more than an opportunist that has made his way to Orenburg to get his own shot at making a play to restore USSR, like the other stronger sort of candidates for Soviet restoration, such as Vorshilov and SVERDLOVSK and Tumen, are trying to do on their own. So that's the third faction. This faction supports actually centralization to a higher degree. In fact, to a high enough degree to seek to return to the institutions of the USSR. The now defunct Union, only with Malenkov's economic programs at the forefront, so without really the economic experience of someone like Bukharin, or even the leadership of the Red Army. A third reformist faction is actually headed by an academic and industrial chemist and plant director, Alexander Burba, the officially reformist faction. They're represented as authoritarian democrat over here, the Burba faction. This faction wants the city to be headed by an effective technocracy, is essentially disguised in the clothing of the existing communal order with the same symbols, with elements of representative democracy thrown into the mix. So this arrangement is meant to ensure stability while allowing the city to unleash its economic potential. Thematically, the battle is about freedom against security, but the choice is really null and void in the power vacuum of the post-USSR Russia. How the shining Venice of New Russia may move forward is uncertain, but what is certain is that to ensure its survival, the old ways will have to be